أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Before we begin our discussion tonight, inshallah, we have been requested to recite a Surah Fatiha for the following marhumin: Sayyid Hamid Ja'fari, Mubin Fatima Ja'fari, Ali Fatima Rizvi, Sayyid Ali Mazahir Ja'fari, and Sayyid Ali Hadi Ja'fari. For these marhumin and for all other mu'mineen and mu'minat who are no longer with us in this world, let us recite a Surah Fatiha preceded by salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Yesterday we discussed the etiquette and the conduct and the akhlaq of the Prophet and how it was something which was very unique, especially in a society where people thought that their honor and their prestige depended on seeming to be all-powerful, on not being influenced by anybody, on not seeking and not listening to anybody else's opinion, but being an island all in themselves. The Prophet introduced a very different form of conduct, a different concept of leadership and strength. And this is something that people sometimes did not understand. They mocked. They viewed it as a weakness of the Prophet. They said, Huwa udhun. He listens to everybody. And the Quran says that yes, he does listen, but it doesn't mean that he is fooled. He listens as a sign of mercy in order to bring the community together, to create a constructive and a positive environment. And that is an obligation that all of us have. Sometimes there are words that we say, there are things that we do, which create a vulnerability within our Muslim community, a weakness within our Muslim community. And we have to make sure that we are aware and we are careful whenever any of these types of events take place. There is a reason why Islam has forbidden gossip and backbiting and ghiba and namima. This verse that I mentioned from Surah Tawbah, and which we discussed yesterday, it was revealed about a nammam, a person who would engage in backbiting, who would convey the Prophet's conversations, which he made in confidence, to people who would not be able to understand them and who might misuse them. And the harm would come back to the entire Muslim community. The Prophet was not going to be harmed. And we have similar types of things going on in our communities. All of us have witnessed it, whether it be in Chicago, whether it be in other cities. Sometimes there are emails that are circulated. A person has a problem with an individual, or maybe with an institution, or maybe with someone else within the community. And rather than confront it directly, they decide the wisest course of action and the smartest course of action is to send an email to their entire contact list. And it becomes now an international issue. That might relieve some of our sense of having been treated unfairly. But it doesn't do anything to improve the situation in society. When we say things, when we pass things on that are not going to contribute to a bettering of the situation of our community, then we are going directly against the teachings and the practices and the wishes of the Prophet. It might simply be a single click of our mouse. And the Prophet, when he is informed of our actions, or when our Imam Ajjalallahu Farajahu Sharif is informed of our actions, they might weep for a long time. And we have to bear that responsibility and be aware of the consequences of our actions. So the etiquette of the Prophet and the conduct of the Prophet and that level of responsibility and that level of discipline, that is something which is very important. Today I would like to move our discussion forward and talk a little bit about the manner of family relations as the Prophet practiced and taught them to be maintained. This is also something which was a revolution that was brought by the Prophet. All of us, we know that there were certain injustices that were done in Arabia. We've all heard that some people, they used to bury their daughters alive. The Quran mentions it. Both the burying alive, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. That when a young girl, born alive, will be asked on the Day of Judgment, what was your sin? And why were you put to death? But this was not something that was widely practiced in Arabia. All of the people that we know of, who were contemporaries of the Prophet and who were companions of the Prophet, all of them were born of women. All of them had sisters, and the names of many of them are recorded in history. It was a moral travesty, but it's not like it was something that was very widespread in all of the tribes of Arabia. In fact, the names of those who used to commit this crime, which the Quran took such a strong stance against, that is something which is mentioned in history, and we'll find that it was not widespread. But the Quran took a strong stance because of the evil of what was being done. That's also a lesson that we have to learn. There are some crimes that are so evil that if they are done to one person, they are worth taking a stand against. It's not the quantity of a crime that makes it despicable. To be in a country, for example, where Guantanamo has existed through more than a decade, through promises, and to be in a country where this type of a travesty of human justice, which was not committed by the most tyrannical regimes in modern history. We won't find an example to compare to this in many of the most evil regimes. Its existence is a travesty. But what is perhaps an even greater travesty is that society and even Muslims, who perhaps should be the most concerned, are sometimes silent. So that is a principle of the Quran, to take a moral stance, not because something is widespread, but because it is important as a moral issue. And there are many other issues like that, which break up families, which break up societies. You know that the number of people in jail in this country is greater in absolute terms and in relative terms. Meaning the number of people is greater than any other country, even countries with larger populations. And the percentage of people is greater than any other country. And again, this is not an issue which is necessarily on our radar or which we think about and speak up about. But what I want to say about the principle of the Prophet is that when he takes these stands about moral issues, sometimes we as Muslims say that we're so much better now. Arabs used to treat their women as property, and we don't treat our women as property. See how wonderful Islam is? Arabs did not let their women inherit, and Islam gave them inheritance. That's not entirely true, by the way. Among some Arab tribes and among the other religions, the Zoroastrian and the Romans and the Jewish religions, with differences and with some forms of minor variation, there was some form of inheritance that did exist for both men and for women. So we sometimes take pride that we don't bury our children alive, we don't have that ignorance, and so we think that we have accomplished something. But what we need to do as Muslims is look at some of the principles which the Prophet brought, which we still have not been able to uphold in our families and in our communities. Instead of taking pride sometimes at how far we have come, we might actually have to be a little bit embarrassed of how far back we still are and how far behind what the Prophet wanted us to become, we have remained. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad. And so let us look at a few examples. I think it is something which is perhaps a divine miracle that the Prophet had probably the most complex and the most difficult family life that anyone could imagine. Sometimes we look at that issue and we think of it only in terms of establishing who is right and who is wrong. That is clear. Who was loyal to the Prophet? Which of the wives of the Prophet obeyed the divine command to remain in their homes, and which did not obey? It is a clear divine commandment, and there are some who obeyed, and there are some who did not obey. Which of the family members or the relatives of the Prophet were able to maintain the honor and the dignity which they were to maintain in Islam, and which were not able to maintain it? That is also something which is clear. But we shouldn't stop and say that, well, because we have understood who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side of Islam, that is all. Imagine what might have been some of the wisdom why Allah put the Prophet through this kind of a test. And it is really the most difficult test. If we have ever been in a difficult situation and the whole world is against us, if a person is in debt and they lose their job, if they have peace at home, then even that difficulty can seem to be something which is surmountable. Inshallah, the sun will rise again and the situation might improve. If there are tragedies that befall a family, if the family has cordial and good relations with one another, then no matter what the tragedy might be, they can find a way to get through it. They find comfort and they find solace in one another. But when a person has the most difficult hardships outside of the home, from friend and from foe, from enemy and from supporter. And then inside the family also there isn't peace. Then you can imagine that it is a very difficult type of struggle and the most hard test that Allah could take from a man or from a woman or from anybody. And Allah put the Prophet through that test. Just to give one example, this is an incident which is narrated in the Sihah and in the most authentic books of Ahadith. The Hadith is narrated from the wife of the Prophet, Aisha bint Abi Bakr. She says that in the Prophet's final illness, when he heard that the Muslims were performing the congregational prayer, he came out from his house when he felt better compared to how he had been a few moments earlier. But this improvement in the health of the Prophet was such that he was not able to walk. وَرِجْلَاهُ تَخُطَّانِ الْأَرْضِ. So the feet of the Prophet were dragging on the ground. He wasn't able to walk. And when the feet of the Prophet were dragging on the ground, then the walking is being done by somebody else. Now, normally, these types of moments, they are preserved in intimate detail by families and by loved ones. Today, when a grandparent, when a senior member of the family is going through these moments, then people may be thousands of miles away, but they will move heaven and earth to be able to be present. And if they are not able to be present, then they will tell their family members that tell us, see if we can in somehow see or speak with our loved one, because we don't know if we will be able to see them in this world or not. And the memory is preserved. Now we have many means of preserving even the visual and the audio memories of our relatives, but in the previous days, people would recount in detail the final moments and the words and the actions and the situation of their loved ones. The wife of the Prophet is recounting the final moments of the Prophet. She says that the Prophet came out. He is unable to walk. He was supported on one shoulder by Fadl ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet and the cousin of Imam Ali, Fadl ibn Abbas, the elder son of Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was the Prophet's uncle. وَرَجُلْ آخر, and some other man. A person narrated this hadith to Abdullah ibn Abbas, who was a witness to the incident and was alive at the time and was a brother of Fadl ibn Abbas. He was also the cousin of the Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam. He said to the person who was narrating the hadith, أَتَعْرِفُ مَنِ الرَّجُلِ الْآخِرِ? Do you know who the other person was? He said, no, I don't know. He said that was the brother and the cousin and the son-in-law of the Prophet. It was Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. ولكن عائشة ما كانت تطيب له بخير أبدا. But it's not as if the person who told you this incident forgot. It's not as if Imam Ali had such a long name, it would take 17, 18 syllables, and it would tire a person out to say it. She just wasn't able to bring her lips to say something. These are the words of Abdullah ibn Abbas in the hadith. It's not something which is coming from a questionable source. Now, my point, though, is that let's not look at this incident just to condemn. Although it is certainly something which is worthy of thought by the body of Muslims who might not appreciate the reality of the relationship between the descendants of the Prophet and others who were surrounding the Prophet in his final moments. It's worthy of that thought. But what we need to do is also look at the fact that with this kind of a sentiment, now we're not talking about some sort of conflict, a different personality. We're talking about a person who would not even be able to honestly convey the final moments of a prophet of God, because there is the name of Ali ibn Abi Talib in the incident. I will request all of you to please move forward and make as much room as you can behind you. And as you do so, please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Not even able to mention the name. And yet the Prophet maintained peace and was able to manage the family for 10 years in Medina. Imagine what type of a struggle it must have been for the Prophet. How difficult must it have been? How much patience and how much discipline and how much self-sacrifice the Prophet must have put into it in order to be able to have patience with this kind of ignorance. And it wasn't one incident. It was many incidents. For people who say that so-and-so or so-and-so must have been the favorite spouse of the Prophet, look at the incidents. And put your own selves in that situation. Or put your children in that situation. And say, would this be something that would be a source of admiration or something that would not be a source of admiration? And if I would not tolerate it, then how can I impugn the memory of the Prophet by saying he would have enjoyed it? If I would not want it for my own children, then how can I say it's something which the Prophet enjoyed? It wasn't that the Prophet enjoyed it, but what we can say is that this is something the Prophet did in order to not only fulfill that divine test, but to set an example for us that even in these types of situations, it is possible to live constructively and to manage things. It doesn't mean that you have to take everything. There were some women who had been married to the Prophet, whom the Prophet did divorce. Sometimes separation is best for the husband and for the wife. There are families in our communities who say that no matter what happens, we're not going to divorce. A poor young man might grow old. A poor young lady might grow old and not be able to start their life after having made perhaps one mistake or gone through a tragic situation, simply because the family says that we are too great to ever have divorce and to enter our houses. The Prophet was not too great. The incident was a fitna that was started by these same people who I won't name, but just to let you know what the incident was. One of the wives of the Prophet came into the Prophet's household, and before the Prophet came, was introduced to one of the wives of the Prophet. And this wife of the Prophet, for some reason, perhaps she thought it was a time to have some fun. She said that, if you say to the Prophet when he sees you, "A'udhu billahi mink," may God protect me from you, then that will make the Prophet admire you a lot. And this woman was a simple lady, perhaps. And so when the Prophet came, she said, "A'udhu billahi mink." And so when the Prophet heard that she had sought refuge in Allah from him, she said, "Ilhaqi bi ahlik," that go back to your family. That might seem to be cruel. It wasn't her fault. But it wasn't cruel on the part of the Prophet. A woman who is that simple would never be able to survive in that kind of environment. It wasn't cruelty on the part of the Prophet that he said, "Go back to your family." It was mercy. Because for the Prophet to bring somebody who didn't have that strength and that ability to deal with animosity into an environment, that would have been cruelty. But my point was that it is not the case that divorce is always evil. Otherwise, the Prophet would have said that whatever happens, now you're going to suffer and we're going to suffer and everyone's going to suffer and you're going to stay here. The Prophet had a place for making peace and he had a place for separation, but it wasn't because he was going to ever ignore the rights of any one member of his family. And that is the broader lesson that we need to learn. That when I get married, it doesn't mean that I kiss my parents goodbye and say, I have a new family now. When I have children, it doesn't mean that my brothers and sisters can no longer count on me to give them financial support or moral support or other kinds of assistance. There is a very interesting message that is given in the Quran. In Surah An-Nisa, verse number 11, some of the rules of inheritance are mentioned. These are the teachings of the Prophet. And the verse mentions, of course, in some detail, the inheritance of parents and the inheritance of children. And then at the end of the verse number 11, Allah says that آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا فريضة من الله إن الله كان عليما حكيما. You might think that you know where your interests lie, but you don't know whether your parents are going to be of greater assistance to you and greater benefit to you, or your children. So don't write off any one relationship, and the principle is even more general than just about parents and just about children. The Quran is saying, don't begrudge the fact that parents have a share of inheritance in the presence of children, and children have a share of the inheritance in the presence of parents. You don't know who is going to be of greater benefit to you in this world. You don't know who is going to be of greater benefit to you in the hereafter. Sometimes we put all our hopes in one person. We invest all of our love and all of our energy and all of our money in one relationship, and that one relationship is the one that never brings us any benefit, any happiness, or any peace. And many people, they live a life and they sometimes have regret at the end, that if only I had been more impartial, if only I had been more fair. The ones who actually cared for me and showed me love and concern and were there for me were not the ones that I was there for when they needed me. And the Quran is telling you, you don't know that. Don't begrudge a wasiyah. Don't begrudge an inheritance. But it is a faridah from Allah, and so fulfill the faridah. Fulfill your relationship to your parents. Fulfill your relationship to your spouses. Fulfill your relationship to your children. There shouldn't be a competition, and there shouldn't be an inability to maintain all of those relationships and honor them, in spite of the fact that sometimes it might take quite a bit of energy and effort. One of the things the Prophet did, and this is one of the beautiful aspects of the seerah of Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, is the way in which he honored his in-laws. When I said earlier that we think about the relationship of the Prophet in terms of the burial of the daughters or the inheritance of women and the considering wives to be chattel or property, this is one of the things that I wanted to say. In our Muslim communities, in many of our Islamic societies, and even here in the West, honoring one's in-laws is not really something which is seen as important and as something which is essential to our good conduct. But you are familiar, and so I will just remind and then move on. The Prophet in Medina had been separated from Khadija salamullahi alayha in this life for many years. He had other family members. He had other dependents. He had many considerations. But it is said that whenever the Prophet was given a gift, whenever he would make a sacrifice of an animal, then he would send the meat or a portion of that gift to the relatives of Khadija and even to the friends of Khadija in order to honor his wife. Many of us, we can't honor our in-laws when our families are alive, let alone for years after they may have left this world. But that was the practice of the Prophet. And it was also the practice of the families of the Prophet. Put yourself in the position of al-Baneen. She has her own children. She has her own household. She has 4 sons. And they are at the peak of their youth. And yet, she doesn't say that this is my family. The sons of Fatima salamullahi alayha, they can take care of themselves. They are a separate family. She tells her sons that you are to go to Karbala, but you are not to come back. I want to hear news of your sacrifice. But I'm not sending you because I want to see you return. That is from both the side of the husband and from the side of the wife. The way in which Ahlul Bayt ﷺ would honor their extended family members and even their in-laws, and not forget them and not put them out of their priorities and out of their thoughts. I want to briefly mention one other incident, and then inshallah we will move on. Making peace with family members is something which was a very, very sacred obligation honored by the Prophet and honored by the progeny of the Prophet. Our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, had to suffer somewhat with his relatives. One of the people because of whom Imam Ja'far Sadiq suffered somewhat was the uncle of the Imam. The uncle in the sense that he was a grandson of Imam Hassan and a grandson of Imam Hussein. His name was Abdullah al-Mahab, and he was known al-Mahab because his father was a descendant of Fatima salamullahi alayha and his mother was a descendant of Fatima. He was the son of Hassan Muthanna, who was the son of Imam Mujtaba, and he was the son of Fatima bint al-Hussein. So both his mother was a son of Imam Hassan, his mother was a daughter of Imam Hussein. So he was on both sides Fatimi. And he had a great deal of prestige and honor in not just Bani Hashim and the descendants of Fatima salamullahi alayha by virtue of his lineage, but also because of his piety and his seniority and his age, but among all of Quraysh and among all of Arabia and among all of the Muslims. And in some cases, it is seen that he felt that he was owed a level of respect and veneration which people sometimes gave to Imam Ja'far Sadiq, who at least in generational terms was one generation after him. Because he was a grandson of Imam Hassan, a grandson of Imam Hussein, so he was in the generation of Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. In generational terms, he was senior to Imam Ja'far Sadiq. But Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam was an imam, he was ma'soom, and he had a great deal of veneration among the people. Now, we might very quickly say that this was jealousy, this was absolutely unforgivable. Anybody, no matter who it might be, who has any kind of disagreement with an imam, then we have nothing to do with them. But look at how the imam treats this relationship. First of all, history tells us, the details are mentioned in many books, that these descendants of Imam Hassan, they were treated very harshly by the Abbasids. The city of Baghdad was built literally on their bodies and with their blood. And when Imam Ja'far Sadiq witnessed how they were taken as captives from Medina to Iraq, then he left his house and he mourned them while they were alive until the Imam was compelled to leave the street and go back into his house. That was the severity of the Imam's grief at their suffering. The incident that I wanted to mention is that once there was some kind of a disagreement between Abdullah ibn Hassan and Imam Ja'far Sadiq. And of course Imam Ja'far Sadiq was in the right. But Abdullah al-Mahab, he either did not realize it or something prevented him from accepting the Imam's position. Now, when this disagreement took place, their voices were raised. And they left without having been able to resolve the dispute. It was night, and the difference of opinion could not be resolved. The hadith tells us that the next morning early, maybe right after Salatul Fajr, Imam Ja'far Sadiq came to the door of Abdullah al-Mahd and knocked on the door. And perhaps one of his children or one of his servants opened the door, saw that Imam Ja'far Sadiq, and no matter what the dispute might have been, Imam Ja'far Sadiq was Imam Ja'far Sadiq, and Abdullah knew it. Said, Ya Aba Abdullah, ma bakkara bik? What brought you so early to my door? And look at the beauty of the reply of the Imam. He is an Imam, and he is in the right. And if any of us had 1/10 of the right of the Imam, then we would never let anyone in the world forget it. I can speak for myself, and I'm sure many of us would have been the same way. The Imam says, Ayatun min kitabillah, qara'tuha fa'aqlaqatni. A verse of the Quran, I read it, it made me feel afraid. And so Abdullah says, what is the verse? And the Imam read from Surah Ra'd, وَالَّذِينَ يَصِلُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُمْ وَيَخَافُونَ سُوءَ الْحِسَابِ. There are those who keep those connections that Allah has commanded them to keep. And they fear their Lord. And they are afraid of being asked for everything that Allah has a right to ask them for. Su'ul hisab, as you have heard in a hadith, Allah does not do su'ul hisab, a bad accounting, by asking you to account for things that you are not guilty of. Allah won't say, why did your neighbor do this? Why did your spouse do this? Why did your friend do this? Allah will only make you account for what you have done. Su'ul hisab, though, is if Allah makes me account for everything I have done, then I will never be able to pass the test. I will never be able to pass the audit. And because we are afraid of that from Allah, we don't hold other people to that tight standard. If we don't want Allah to keep us on a tight leash, then we don't keep others on a tight leash. Imam says, Ayatun min kitabillah, qara'tuha fa'aqlaqatni. I read this verse, it made me afraid. The Imam was not afraid, but he knew that this verse was a mutual relationship. يَصِلُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ means that there has to be a relationship maintained on both sides. So even if he is in the right, if there is something that he can do to maintain those ties, then he has to do whatever is in his ability to maintain the ties, unless the other person cuts them and does not allow them to be maintained. And then Abdullah began to weep. He said that it's as if I never read this verse in the Quran, or I never realized it. And he brought the Imam forward, and they hugged, and they made their peace. And so this was the nature of the relationship of our ma'sumin alayhimus salatu wassalam. They maintained that level of closeness and that level of forgiveness with their relatives, with their family members, with their in-laws. They didn't blot out any one relationship because of other relationships. And when our imams were blessed with family members, when they were blessed with spouses, children who were especially noble and pious, the imams appreciated them very highly. The Prophet never ceased to praise Khadija to herself and to others. It's not going to diminish you to praise your spouse or your family members. The Prophet gave her bishara, the good tidings of her place in Jannah. He praised her to others. Imam Hussain alayhi salatu was salam has poetry in praise of Rabab and his daughter. And people came to the Imam and criticized, you, a grandson of the Prophet, praising your wife? And the Imam says that I will never take back these words. A house in which Rabab is, and a house in which Sukaina, or the daughter that we generally speak of as Sakina, a house in which Sakina is a house that I consider to always be flourishing. Rabab had 2 children who were present in Karbala. One was named Abdullah, and generally we know of him as Ali Asghar. Perhaps it might have been that he resembled his brother Ali Akbar, and so he was given that nickname, and Sukaina or Sakina. It was a family that had come with the Imam to Karbala. And this night of Ashura, this was a night when families were making their final wills and having their final words with one another. As you know, the Battle of Karbala was to begin on the 9th of Muharram. It wasn't supposed to begin on Ashura. Imam Hussein specifically asked his brother Abbas to go to the enemy and to ask for one more night. The Imam's purpose was, of course, to engage in ibadah. But I think there were many, many more messages the Imam had than simply to engage in ibadah and recitation of Quran and salat. That is what they engaged in throughout the night. But the Imam had other messages as well. He also wanted to give more time to some sisters, and to some mothers, and to some brothers, and to relatives, in order to take one last long look at people whom they were going to be separated with for the rest of their lives. The Imam wanted to call his companions together and to turn off the candle, to blow out the candle, and to say, these soldiers, they're coming for me. And I thank you for staying with me until now, and I have forgiven you of your pledge. So go and take one of my family members with you. You are free. And then Abu al-Fadl Abbas stood up. And then one by one the companions stood up. And they said, even if we had 1,000 lives, we would lay each and every one of them down with you. You are our master. You are our Imam. You are the grandson of the Prophet, and we shall never abandon you. But perhaps the most painful conversations were when mothers called their young children before them and said, my son, you have not yet gone to battle. But tomorrow on the Day of Judgment, I am going to stand before the daughter of the Prophet of God. I am going to stand before the Messenger of God. I am going to stand before Amir al-Mu'mineen. And your mother does not want to be embarrassed. Promise me that when you see 1,000 swords, that you will not turn your back. And perhaps even more difficult was the reply given by those young martyrs. That, mother, I have just come from the tent in which Sayyid al-Shuhada has told each of us about our martyrdom. Mother, that I am ready for martyrdom, but I have been told that you are going to see my body trampled. You are going to see my head cut and raised on a spear. Mother, if you are telling me to have patience in front of swords, I know that I will be able to do so. But what I am asking you to do is even more difficult. Because you will have to follow those heads on spears, not just for a few moments of battle, but for an entire journey. From Karbala to Kufa, and from Kufa to Sham. Karbala के जितने शहीद थे, वो अपनी मर्जी और अपने इख्तियार के साथ शहादत पेश कर रहे थे. कोई भी मजबूर न था. लेकिन उन शुहदा में एक शहीद हैं जो अपनी ज़बान से जज्बा शहादत बयान नहीं कर सकते, ज़बान से इज़्न जिहाद नहीं ले सकते, अपने पांव पे खड़े नहीं हो सकते कि जाके मैदान जंग में जंग करें. ये वो इमाम का शिशमाहा बेटा है जो अपने आप को गहवारे से गिरा के बयान करते हैं कि मैं भी अपनी कुर्बानी देने के लिए आमादा हूं. जब से अब्बास शहीद हुए हैं तो सकीना असगर की प्यास को देख रही हैं, लेकिन अब उसके बाद पानी न मांगा. रबाब की आंखों में आंसू खुश्क हो गए हैं, लेकिन अपने मौला से पानी न मांगा. امام الوداع کہنے کے لیے خیمے میں آئے ہیں. اپنے بیٹے پہ نگاہ پڑتی ہے. وہ گہوارہ ہے جس میں ایک بچہ کبھی روتا تھا، اب تو روتا بھی نہیں. اور امام اپنی بہن سے کہتے ہیں یا زینب ناولینی ابنی، اے بہن زینب یہ میرا بیٹا مجھے دو، میں اسے بھی الوداع کہہ دوں. لیکن پھر جب امام نے علی اصغر کے چہرے کو دیکھا اور پھر ان خشک ہونٹوں کو دیکھا تو امام نے بیٹے کو اپنی عبا کے نیچے رکھا اور باہر کی طرف جانے لگے. رباب نے آواز دی مولا اسے کہاں لے کے جا رہے ہیں؟ تو امام نے فرمایا کہ شاید دشمن اس بچے پہ رحم کر لے. امام معصوم اشقیاء کے سامنے جا رہے ہیں پانی مانگنے. جب باہر جاتے ہیں اور دشمنوں کی طرف بڑھتے ہیں تو وہ سمجھتے ہیں کہ شاید امام قرآن لے کے آئے ہیں، شاید اب جنگ سے خستہ ہو گئے ہیں، جنگ کو روکنا چاہ رہے ہیں. لیکن جب امام نے ردا ہٹائی، اپنی عبا ہٹائی، تو دیکھتے ہیں ایک چھوٹا بچہ ہے پیاس کی وجہ سے تڑپ رہا ہے. اور امام نے اونچا اٹھا کے کہا کہ اما ترون کیف یتلظی عطشا، کیا تم نہیں دیکھتے کہ یہ بچہ کس طرح سے پیاس کی وجہ سے تڑپ رہا ہے؟ امام کی زبان حال یوں بیان ہوتی ہے، اور کوئی بعید نہیں ہے کہ اس مشکل منظر میں امام نے اپنے شیعوں کو یاد کیا ہوگا. شیعتی لیتکم فی یوم عاشوراء جمیعا تنظرونی کیف استسقی لطفلی فابوا ان یرحمونی. اے میرے شیعوں کاش تم میرے ساتھ ہوتے کربلا میں اور دیکھتے میں مهما شربتم ماء عذب فاذكروني او سمعتم بغریب او شہید فاندبونی. اے میرے شیعو جب بھی میٹھا پانی پینا تو مجھ غریب کو یاد کرنا، میری مظلومیت کو یاد کرنا. جب بھی کسی غریب الوطن کا تذکرہ ہو یا کسی کی شہادت کا تذکرہ ہو تو مجھ پر رونا، میری مظلومیت پر رونا. امام کی گفتگو نے دشمنوں کے درمیان بھی تلاطم مچایا. عمر ابن سعد پریشان ہوا کہ اگر امام گفتگو کرتے رہے تو ہو سکتا ہے کہ دشمن بھی نرم گوشہ رکھیں اور امام کی حاجت کو پورا کر لیں. حرملہ ابن کاہل الاسدی کو عمر ابن سعد نے حکم دیا یا حرملہ اقطع کلام الحسین، اے حرملہ امام کے خطبے کو بند کر دو، قطع کر دو. تو حرملہ نے ایک 3 شعبے والا تیر اپنے کمان میں رکھا. تیر تو گھوڑوں کو گرانے کے لیے بنائے جاتے تھے، جنگجوؤں کو گرانے کے لیے بچائے جاتے تھے، بچوں کے لیے تو تیر نہیں بنتے تھے. وہ تیر حرملہ نے مارا اور مقتل کے جملے ہیں کہ جب وہ آ کے علی اصغر کے گلے میں پیوست ہوا فَذُبِحَ مِنَ الْأُذُنِ إِلَى الْأُذُنِ. امام کا بچہ امام کے ہاتھوں میں امام نے علی اصغر کا خون اپنے ہاتھوں میں جمع کیا، آسمان پہ پھینکنا، زمین پہ پھینکنا چاہا تو زمین سے ندا آئی کہ کبھی کوئی پودا نہ اگے گا. امام نے وہ خون پھر امام نے خیمے کی طرف پلٹنا شروع کیا. امام نے علی اکبر کا بھی لاشا اٹھایا تھا، عباس کے بھی بازو اٹھائے تھے, حضرت قاسم کے لاشے کے ٹکڑے بھی اٹھائے تھے, لیکن اب علی اصغر کا جنازہ خیمے کی طرف آ رہا ہے. امام جب رباب کے خیمے کو دیکھتے ہیں تو پیچھے ہٹ جاتے ہیں, انا للہ و انا الیہ راجعون. پھر آگے بڑھتے ہیں, انا للہ و انا الیہ راجعون. 7 دفعہ امام آگے بڑھتے ہیں, پیچھے ہٹتے ہیں, اور پھر روایت میں ملتا ہے کہ ام کلثوم آگے بڑھی, علی اصغر کا لاشا گود میں لیا اور مرثیہ پڑھا, وَلَحْفَاءَ فُطِمَا بِسِّهَامِ الْأَعْدَاءِ. Kulthum recited a marthiyah for her nephew Ali Asghar. She said normally when children reach an age where they can eat solid foods, then they are weaned from their mother's milk. But this is my nephew Ali Asghar. He was وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ.